Franklin Delano Roosevelt was not only a transformational leader for our country and our world, but he was also a revolutionary leader for people with disabilities. After contracting polio and losing the ability to walk, FDR realized aggressive treatment was needed to fight the devastating effects of the disease. He also realized that his disability could destroy his aspiring political career. In 1924, he traveled to Warm Springs, a small town in west central Georgia, for treatment. Roosevelt purchased a resort property there, and because of his leadership, the Warm Springs Foundation was created to treat patients with polio, and the National Foundation for Infantile Paralysis was formed. His legacy continues through the Roosevelt Warm Springs and the March of Dimes. Included in his legacy is a much more positive perception of people with disabilities. After graduating from Harvard in 1904, Roosevelt attended Columbia Law School from 1905 to 1907. He started his political career when he was elected New York State Senator in 1910. 3 years later, Franklin Roosevelt was appointed Assistant Secretary of the Navy in 1913 and served through World War I. In 1921, Roosevelt contracted polio and his political career was put on hold. According to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, polio, or poliomyelitis, is an infectious viral disease that can strike at any age and affects the person's nervous system. In the late 1940s to the early 1950s, polio inflicted an average of more than 35,000 people in the United States each year. It was one of the most feared diseases of the 20th century. In 1924, Franklin Roosevelt traveled by train to Warm Springs, Georgia, a long way from his home in New York. He had not walked in 3 years and was hopeful that he could find a treatment for his condition there. He found the warm, mineralized water helped. He fell in love with Warm Springs so much that he spent 2/3 of his personal wealth to purchase the resort there. He said, "Newcomers do not quite understand until they have been here a week or two, but it gets them all, the old spirit of Warm Springs." According to Mr. David Burke, historical interpreter for the National Park Service at Warm Springs and author of Images of America, Warm Springs, Warm Springs had a profound impact on Franklin D. Roosevelt.
This is where Franklin Roosevelt became FDR. Yes, he was the former vice presidential candidate. They lost in 1920. He's the former assistant secretary to the Navy. Ran a lot of legislation through Congress, but this is where he became, again, FDR, the president, the man that we know, the man that we elected as our president 4 times.
The Warm Springs Foundation was incorporated in 1927. During the early days of the Warm Springs Foundation, FDR was patient number 1. He was referred to as Doc because he helped design exercises and worked with the other patients. Authors of the Warm Springs Foundation annual report from 1941 described the atmosphere of cheer, optimism, and good fellowship amongst the patients. They said, if it were not for the braces, crutches, and wheelchairs, one would not think from observing the happy faces and listening to the good-natured conversation and laughter that these were any but able-bodied people indulging in a rest cure. It was always a lively, joyful, and exciting atmosphere, and patients loved it at Warm Springs, especially when Franklin D. Roosevelt was there. Suzanne Pike was a patient at the facility in 1935. She recalls her time there fondly.
I was invited by Mr. Roosevelt to a Thanksgiving dinner. He was standing at the door. He was shaking hands with all the patients that came in. And when I came in, my mother said, he said, "Little girl, what is your name?" And I told him Suzanne. I love the name Suzanne, but I'd like to call you Susie. Is that all right? And I said, uh-huh.
As the program grew, patients came from all over the world. Studies conducted at Warm Springs received an endorsement from the American Orthopedic Association. Physical therapists, they called physios, came there to train on the latest practices. Facilities were improved, including the famous T pool.
This place was definitely a model for other treatment facilities for people with polio. The use of the warm water therapy and the pool exercises was widely copied around the country, or widely established, and that's what FDR wanted.
Nowadays, the Georgia Warm Springs Foundation is known as Roosevelt Warm Springs. The facility is part rehabilitation center for people with disabilities and also a vocational training center that helps people who are handicapped find and train for productive careers. In 1938, the National Foundation for Infantile Paralysis was created to expand on the work done by the Georgia Warm Springs Foundation. Among the most famous efforts funded by the National Foundation for Infantile Paralysis is the development of polio vaccinations. Jonas Salk and Albert Sabin are credited with creating both a live and weakened virus vaccine to prevent polio. Today, the National Foundation for Infantile Paralysis is known as the March of Dimes because of its extremely successful fundraising campaigns where children collect dimes to help cure polio.
Roosevelt's on this dime to end polio and worldwide, and we have. But this is a tribute to the fact that we don't have polio.
Along with his contributions to the polio community, Franklin D. Roosevelt's legacy also includes an improvement of the perception of people with disabilities. Historically, people with disabilities were kept in their homes or placed in asylums. Commonly, people who were physically handicapped were considered crippled. Roosevelt felt that rehabilitation should be accessible to people who are disabled regardless of their wealth or their disability. Many people do not know that Franklin D. Roosevelt was an amateur architect. His little White House is as accessible today as it was when it was built in the 1930s. Despite being unable to walk, Franklin D. Roosevelt was an optimistic and confident role model for both able-bodied and disabled people alike.
He told us we had nothing to fear but fear ourselves. That's because he had seen firsthand what people with disabilities were going through. He overcame his. He was a man that couldn't walk, took a nation that was crippled, and led it through the Great Depression. That right there is an amazing feat.
President Franklin D. Roosevelt's leadership has left a profound legacy for people with disabilities. Roosevelt Warm Springs is still treating patients today and has treated an estimated 45,000 people with many different kinds of disabilities. Its model programs have influenced rehabilitation and treatment around the world. The facility still uses the water from the Warm Springs and provides rehabilitation, therapeutic recreation, and vocational training. Following successful vaccination programs and polio's virtual eradication in the United States, the March of Dimes has turned its focus to raising funds and awareness to prevent birth defects. Franklin Roosevelt's influence on the perception of people with disabilities is far-reaching. His legacy as an amazing, optimistic role model for the mobility impaired has had a huge but intangible effect on the perception of people with disabilities.
He is the most important role model to me. He is often known as the president who was in a wheelchair. Not the person who was in a wheelchair that became president. People thought of his abilities first and not his disabilities. That is how I like to think of myself. If a person in a wheelchair could be such an amazing president and lead our country through the Great Depression and World War II, I don't see a limit to what I can be.